Hello, welcome back to History 321. I am Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is video number 15. All right, we are still talking about the years after the end of Reconstruction. I think the very last thing we had talked about was the United States Supreme Court decision entitled Plessy versus Ferguson that literally made the separation of races legal in the United States. It created what Plessy versus Ferguson said was that it was that racism was okay, that you could separate the races as long as the accommodations that were made available to both races were they could be separate, but they had to be equal. Now, the reality is that they certainly were separate, but they were far, far from equal. Okay, let's talk about economic progress after Reconstruction. Well, that economic progress, and we've mentioned this already, was extraordinarily slow. That lost economic ground, the economic ground that had been lost during the Civil War, was not recovered in some segments of the state economy until the 1920s. Now, you do the math on that. Almost 60 years it took for some portions of the Louisiana economy to get back to what it had been before the beginning of the Civil War. Towns did not experience growth during this time. If they grew, it was slow. Louisiana towns were slow to install infrastructure, for example, city lighting, clean water systems, paved streets, storm drains um, became rather common outside the South, but inside the South were still rather rare, and that applied to Louisiana um, as well. Now, some new towns were established during this time, though. It wasn't all gloom and doom. The city of Ruston was established in 1884. The city of Crowley was um, established in the year 1887. New Orleans made a comeback. So when we talk about Louisiana being slow to recover, I suppose what I'm really saying is that Louisiana outside of New Orleans was slow to recover. It made quite a comeback, as a matter of fact. It grew rapidly. It had to, because its location demanded that trade be reestablished, that north to south and south to north trade on the Mississippi River, so critical to the United States economy, it had to be reestablished. And so New Orleans regains its importance as a distribution center as well as a commerce center. Excuse me. The town of Shreveport also grew during this time. So let me give you some numbers. Now, I don't expect you to memorize these, but I just want to give you these numbers so you'll understand what was happening by the 1920s in Louisiana. Okay, let's talk about population growth. All right. Um, Now, this is not a total list of all towns in Louisiana. Um, by 1920, New Orleans population was about 387,000. Shreveport was 44,000. Shreveport was the second largest town in Louisiana behind New Orleans, and yet it only had 44,000 people. Baton Rouge only had 22,000. Baton Rouge, Shreveport was twice as big as Baton Rouge. Alexandria had 18,000. Lake Charles, 13,000. Monroe, 13,000. Crowley, 6,000. Now, that's an amazing number because Crowley had not been established until 1887. And yet, just a couple of decades later, 3.5 decades later, Crowley had 6,000 people. Morgan City had 5,000. And Houma had 5,000. Now, it was not until around 1900 that agricultural production and crop prices and the amount of land under cultivation in Louisiana recovered to pre-Civil War levels. It takes 40 years. One of the reasons why the Louisiana agricultural economy began to grow, though, was rice cultivation. The decline in agricultural production would have been much, much worse had it not been for rice cultivation. Now, rice had been grown on the lower Mississippi River prior to the Civil War, along Bayou Lafourche, and in ponds near Breaux Bridge. And we know that Breaux Bridge is on the Teche. In the late 1870s, a company called the North American Land and Timber Company bought a huge piece of property in southwest Louisiana. It was a triangle shaped piece of land. It reached from Abbeville in the east to Orange, Texas in the west, and to Opelousas in the north. Big triangle. And the North American Land and Timber Company realized, they found that that land was ideally suited to grow rice. Several varieties of Japanese rice were imported into Louisiana. Investors with extra capital, extra money, mostly from the Midwest, by the way, bought tracts of that huge triangle, and everybody began to grow rice. And rice cultivation began to prosper, and became a very profitable venture. Now, sugarcane. Sugarcane was an old crop in Louisiana. But by 1895, about 30 years after the Civil War ends, those old cane varieties that had been so common in Louisiana and had been so profitable uh, became diseased. And new varieties of cane were required. And this cane was introduced into Louisiana from Cuba. Now, those new varieties prospered at first, but then they also became prone to disease. So, what are we going to do? Well, new strains of cane were introduced from Asia, from Java, from here in the United States, from Florida, and from South Asia, from India. Now, by this time, Louisiana State University was in existence, and they had an agriculture department, and they did experimentation on plants. And the LSU Agriculture Department began to develop new strains of cane. Remember that Napoleon had planned to create a Western Hemisphere empire based on the fact that the French owned Haiti, which was extraordinarily profitable for the French because of the cane. and because the French owned Louisiana with all of its resources. Now, what we've said, at least I hope I said, if I didn't say it, let me say it for the first time. What was here, the resources that were here, were largely unknown to most people. People knew that there were a lot of fish, right? Um, People knew that there was a lot of game. People knew that there were trees that could be used for wooden ship building. People knew that stuff. The fur trade would prosper in Louisiana. But those were the things that you could see with the naked eye, right? What, as it turns out, there were a lot of resources in Louisiana that were hidden to the human eye and would need to be discovered and developed and made profitable. So, what were some of these natural resources that became very profitable and I would go as far as to say indispensable for industry at the latter part of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century? Now, this is in no order of importance, okay? I'm just naming some of these things. Natural gas. One of the things about natural gas is that whenever you find petroleum, whenever you find oil, you're going to find natural gas. And the early oil explorers here in Louisiana and in Texas and in Oklahoma, they knew that gas was a sign of oil. They knew what to do with the oil. They made grease and lubricants and things like that, and kerosene. Later, gasoline and diesel. But the natural gas, they couldn't figure a use for it, and so they burned it. No, no one will ever know how many bajillions of dollars of natural gas was burned as a unwanted companion to the oil. There was sulfur. Now, those early oil explorers also discovered that although it was no guarantee, that quite often when you found a sulfur deposit, that oil would be there too. So, and of course, oil. Salt. The same thing is true of salt that was true of sulfur. Whenever you find a salt dome out in the marsh somewhere, it is likely that you are going to find oil deposits near there. Of course, some of the old resources were still available and still were very profitable. The fur-bearing animals, fish, shellfish, oysters, stuff like that, crawfish, and then there was lumber. Now, industry began moving to Louisiana in the early part of the 20th century for a number of reasons. First of all, the natural resources that were here that could be used by these industries that were moving into the state. Pardon me. The relatively mild climate, almost uh, limitless fresh water supply, low priced fuel. They finally began to figure out that they could burn natural gas as a fuel, right? So they're still going to burn it, but they're going to get some use out of it as it's being burned. Low cost labor, both black and poor white labor, was readily available by industry, and there was cheap water transportation. Uh, this Louisiana was literally crisscrossed by a network of navigable rivers and streams and lakes that made getting from one place to another, especially out in the marsh, out in the swamp, not easy, but a little easier. Next to agriculture, lumber was the biggest industry from 1865 all the way to 1900. There were vast cypress swamps all over the state of Louisiana. Cypress swamps were not limited to South Louisiana, but they were everywhere you looked. You couldn't walk without stumbling over a cypress swamp. In southeastern and in southwestern Louisiana, there were vast forests of yellow pine. And some of those trees were so big at the base that three grown men could not reach around them. They were humongous. In North Louisiana, especially, there was a mix of hardwood and pine. And so, all over the state of Louisiana, lumber mills sprang up. And we are familiar, even today, with the names of some of those lumber towns. How about Bogalusa? Amite was a lumber town. Plaquemine, Pattersonville, Lake Charles, DeRitter. Those were the main lumber towns of the state. Now, oil was first discovered in the year 1901 over near Jennings. And then just a little bit later near White Castle. Pardon me. But those early oil wells were really unimportant because they didn't produce that much. People knew the oil was there because they had hit oil, but was it enough oil to make it economically worth it to spend the money that it was going to take to get it out of the ground? And remember, first time, 1901 in Jennings. Not until 1906. It takes 5 years. In 1906, a large oil field came in up near Shreveport. And that oil field, it was soon discovered, had enough oil to make it economically feasible to develop the field. And of course, the discoveries were made here, there, and yonder, all over the state of Louisiana. In 1909, Standard Oil Company, which is now Exxon, Standard Oil Company built a refinery in Baton Rouge. That refinery still exists. Of course, it's been modernized. All that old equipment has been replaced over the years. But the Standard Oil, the Exxon refinery at Baton Rouge, is still one of the largest petroleum and chemical complexes in the entire world. You can make a strong argument that petrochemicals, oils and chemical, right, are the lifeblood of Louisiana. Sulfur mining began commercially in Calcasieu Parish. That's over by Lake Charles. In 1895, the field that was discovered over there provided 3/4 of all the United States sulfur until 1914. It was a huge uh, deposit of sulfur. And of course, other deposits were discovered in other parts of Louisiana. Natural gas, which had been considered a worthless byproduct of oil exploration, it was burned to get rid of it. It becomes more and more valuable as a fuel. Seafood. Oh, now you're talking about something that gets my attention. That's eating. Seafood. Now, seafood was normally, back in those days, a local delicacy because you couldn't preserve it until some bright guy invented a refrigerated train car. And now you could ship that seafood, you could ship those oysters and those shrimp and those crawfish for that matter, and the fish, everything. You could ship it from here to New York, from here to LA, from here to Chicago, and it would get there in really good condition because it had been iced down and chilled. At one time in the late 19th and early 20th century, listen to this stat, this is unbelievable. At one time in the late 19th and early 20th century, Louisiana alone, just Louisiana by itself, provided more furs than the entire nation of Canada. And Canada was famous for its fur. It was a valuable source for extra income, especially in South Louisiana. Some people were full-time trappers, of course. Some people held down a regular job. They worked 40 hours a week, and then in their spare time, they ran a trap line. I worked with a guy at Chevron Chemical Company in Baytown, Texas for 21 years. And he made more money trapping part-time in the marsh in southeast Texas than he made as an operator in a chemical plant, and we were making good money. Good money. As late as 1877, which generally was the close of Reconstruction, right? Water transportation was still the most important method of travel in Louisiana. Steamboats ran from Louisiana cities on the Mississippi and Red River to cities on the Ohio and the Missouri rivers. Small ships, smaller ships, uh, could go into the small rivers and small. They they made it possible for you to pretty much get anywhere in Louisiana that you needed to go. I remember my grandfather. My grandfather was born in 1898, and as a boy, he remembers the steamboats coming up the Talbot River all the way to Springfield. Now, at Springfield, you can navigate the Talbot River up to Springfield, but when you pass the bridge on LA 22 in Springfield, the river becomes too shallow and it's no longer navigable. But he could remember very distinctly those beautiful steamboats coming up the Talbot River all the way to Springfield, and of course, ocean-going vessels uh, then would uh, uh, steamboats would carry the food and the cattle and things like that down to New Orleans, where they would be uh, they would be reloaded onto ocean-going vessels, and so all of this stuff then was sent out to the rest of the world. As a matter of fact, it wasn't just New Orleans. The Mississippi River, if you know anything about Louisiana and the Mississippi River, you know that that river is deep and wide, way north of New Orleans, including Baton Rouge. So both New Orleans here in Louisiana, both New Orleans and Baton Rouge, they are river ports. That's true, but they are also seaports. Now, Captain Shreve, we've talked about Captain Shreve and clearing the Great River Raft on the Red River. Well, that raft kept coming back. It would have to be re-cleared every few years. Well, finally, the Red River was finally cleared of the Great Raft by 1870s, and boats were constantly working to keep it clear. And so now the Red River you could navigate the Red River all the way up to Shreveport. So in effect, Shreveport becomes a ocean port as well. You could leave Shreveport and you could go to England if you wanted to. By the end of the century, railroads had built through much of the state, and the day of the great steamships was coming to an end. It would take a while for that day to get here, but it became obvious that railroads were going to take over where the steamboats had been so very important. Um, with regard to highways, well, it's just really simple. We didn't have any. We had very few highways in the state of Louisiana. And what we had was ungraded parish roads, mostly just dirt trails, hog trails, some people would call them. They were dusty when they were dry, and they were muddy when they were wet, and they were usually one or the other. Individual parishes maintained what few roads existed, but only in their parishes, only within the boundaries of their parishes. Now, let's return, please, to a further discussion of sharecropping. Now, I don't want to literally replow this old ground. I'm not going to repeat myself in every way, but there are some things that I didn't tell you in that sharecropping lecture that I want to share with you now, please. Even with this industrial growth that began to occur in Louisiana, the state remained mainly agricultural at the end of the 19th century, at the end of the 1800s. Cotton was still the king. It was the money crop of choice by most Louisiana farmers. Sugarcane was flourishing, and rice production was flourishing as well. Now, um, there were problems with southern agriculture. And the biggest problem is that as late as as late as 1890, most southern farms, and that includes Louisiana farms, were operated by people who did not own the land. And of course, we have a special word to describe those people. They're called sharecroppers. Let me give you some numbers. Now, once again, I don't expect you to, I'm not going to ask you for these numbers. It's just that I'm trying to illustrate how common sharecropping was. In Mississippi, 62% of the farmers were sharecroppers. Now, you do the math. That means that only 38% of the farmers own the land that they farm. Okay, Mississippi, 62%. South Carolina, 61%. Georgia, 60%. Alabama, 58%. And here in Louisiana, 58% of all the farmers were sharecroppers. And you know, because of that previous lecture, that there was the way that sharecropping should have worked and the way that sharecropping actually did. Okay, let's move forward in time now. And let's go to the 1920s. We're coming further and we're coming closer and closer to the present, aren't we? In the 50 years between the end of Reconstruction and the election of Huey Long as governor of Louisiana, the only serious challenge to the rule of the Bourbons, or the Redeemers, came in 1890s from the Populists, and we've talked about that. We're not gonna replow that ground, but we do know how the Bourbons finally destroyed the Populists. They did that by denying blacks and poor whites of the right to vote. Now, populism took different forms in different places. Populists were considered to be reformers. Now, generally, reform is considered to be identifying a problem and then doing something to fix the problem. And usually that means that we're going to do something good for the people. We're going to do something that will help the people if we're going to put reform into place. But that's not what happened in Louisiana and in some of the other southern states. In Louisiana, the populists did in fact claim to be reform, the The Bourbons did, in fact, claim to be reformers. But what form did their reform take? It took the form of taking the right to vote and the margin away from blacks and poor whites and marginalizing them. Now, so let's talk about populism in Louisiana. Louisiana was probably the least democratic state in the Union, the least responsive to public opinion of all the states. The elites of society had always controlled the South, and nowhere was that more true than in the state of Louisiana. The Bourbons, the Democratic leaders of the state, were not just distrustful of the populists, they were hostile to the populists. The Bourbons didn't have a serious commitment to democracy. They wanted to run things the way they ran things. The Bourbons were contemptuous of the majority. The Bourbons considered that they knew what was best for everybody. Now, when the Populist Party arrives in Louisiana, it arrives in around 1892. And when populism appears first in Louisiana, it shouldn't surprise us to know that it appears first in the poor parishes of the state. And the very poorest parishes of the state were up in northern Louisiana. Now, in the governor's election of 1892, the Bourbons were shocked when a populist candidate got 10% of the vote. This was totally out of the blue. It was totally unexpected. That man's name was Robert Tanhill, Tannehil. He received 10% of the popular vote, and that was just absolutely unheard of. That a third party candidate would get that many votes. Now, that happens in 1892. And so the populists, I mean, they don't win anything, but they've made a strong showing. And so they are encouraged and they are looking forward to the elections of 1894, expecting a stronger showing in 1894. Now, remember which party from the Civil War could depend on the black vote, and it was the Republican Party. Sure, it was. In 1894, some northern Louisiana blacks, remember, blacks could still vote, not as many, but they still could vote. In 1894, some North Louisiana blacks began to vote populist instead of Republican. And of course, this frightened the daylights out of the Bourbons. They disrespected blacks, they disrespected poor whites, but they began to be afraid of the blacks and the poor whites also. Now, the blacks historically voted Republican. The poor whites historically voted Democrat. But both the blacks and the poor whites began to show indications that they were going to abandon their old party and start voting populist. As a matter of fact, the blacks had already started doing that very thing. In 1896, something called a fusion ticket occurs. And what is a fusion? It's two different things coming together, right? And mixing. That's what fusion is. Well, this ticket is called the fusion ticket because it is a combination of North Louisiana populists, right, mostly whites, banding together with black Republicans from the river parishes, and they ran a candidate. They supported a populist candidate by the name of John Farr, Pharr. Now, Farr was running against the incumbent governor, who we mentioned. His name was Murphy Foster. We also said, if you recall, that Murphy Foster was the governor of Louisiana in 1898, when the process of depriving most black voters and about a quarter of the poor white voters of the vote takes place. So this is all happening during this time period. Now, the result is that the Democratic Party, the Bourbons, get in the governor's race with John Farr representing the Fusionists and Murphy Foster representing the Bourbon Democrats. The result is that the Democrats get 116,000 votes statewide, and the Fusionists get 88. Now, the evidence of your eyes would suggest that the Democrats won easily. The Democrats won handily. But voting fraud. Many political scientists say today that that election was stolen by the Democrats from the fusion ticket. There was voting fraud all over the state of Louisiana, most especially in the plantation parishes of East Carroll, Madison, Tensas, West Feliciana. Right? Now, to show you, I mean, we'll never be able to prove this, but West Feliciana had a heavy black population that you could expect would go for Farr, who was the populist candidate. But in West Feliciana Parish, that was not the case at all. Now, the number I'm going to give you, I'm going to have to repeat it because you're not going to believe it when I say it the first time. In the gubernatorial election, the governor's election of 1896, Murphy Foster, the incumbent Democratic Bourbon, gets 9,499 votes in West Feliciana Parish. His opponent, Farr, gets 1 vote. Now, folks, a blind man can see that something is terribly wrong here. 94.99 to 1. And that happens maybe not quite as egregiously, but that happens all across Louisiana. Remember, the Bourbons were in charge, and so it was easy, rather easy, for the Bourbons to conduct this widespread corruption and cheating in the election of 1896. Um, the demographics of Louisiana began to change in the 20th century. What does that word mean, demographic? Well, demo is the Greek word for the people, right? So um, uh, a demographic is fundamentally a sort of a snapshot of the people. We talk about age demographics and gender demographics and political demographics. Well, in Louisiana, let's talk about the labor demographics. In 1880, in Louisiana, 68% of all employed males were farmers. Let me say that again. 1880, 68% of employed males were farmers. In 1900, just 20 years later, only 64% of all employed males were farmers. So it's dropped, but it's not dropped considerably from 68 to 64%. But look here, 1910. In 1910, only 50% of all employed males were farmers. And by 1920, which is what we're talking about now, only 43% of employed males were farmers. So what were they doing? If they're not farming, what were they doing? Well, they are getting industrial jobs. As all of these industries that we mentioned a few moments ago, as the oil and gas industry, as sulfur and salt and all of those things, as they become a lumber, as they become more common, people begin to leave farming, which is not, being a farmer is a crapshoot, isn't it? Because of weather and uh, uh, prices in the market, you can never be guaranteed that you're going to be able to make ends meet if you're a farmer. But if you're working 40 hours a week for Standard Oil Company at a refinery in Baton Rouge, that's a steady source of money coming in. And if you're a married man with a family, a steady paycheck, a check that you can depend on, is a precious thing. The changes were the result of the petroleum and sulfur and natural gas jobs that men were taking. Um, Now, what we need to remind you of is that by this time, by the early 1900s, Louisiana was basically a one-party state. On paper, the Republicans existed, didn't they? But in reality, it was only black Louisianians who were Republicans, and they had had the vote taken away from them. So, for all practical intents and purposes, although we were a two-party system on paper, the reality is that we were a one-party system, and that was the Democratic Party. Now, as these new industries came into Louisiana, quite often they brought their executives with them. Now, they hired Louisiana workers to work in the refineries and in whatever. But the bosses of the companies brought in from other places, and many of those came from the North. And the North had a legitimate two-party political system. So when these executives came to Louisiana from the North, where a healthy two-party system existed, they joined with the existing and emerging middle class in Louisiana to insist on an honest and efficient state and local government. Ooh, we've never had that in Louisiana. We have this tradition of corruption and dishonesty, um, inefficiency. These men desired to elect officials in the state of Louisiana who would grow the state of Louisiana rather than line their own pockets illegally, and who would put the interest of the state of Louisiana and its people above personal gain. Louisiana elected its first true reform governor. And when I say reform, I use it in the northern sense of the term. Louisiana elected its first reform governor in 1920, and that man's name was John Parker. So let's talk about Parker for just a moment. He was governor for one term. That's it, 1920 to 1924. He was honest. He was businesslike. He was a planter and a businessman. He was a supporter of the Progressive Party of Theodore Roosevelt that had run for the presidency in 1912, the so-called Bull Moose Party. And the Bull Moose Party was a reform party. Parker became responsible for a new state constitution being written in 1921 after he's the governor. He's the guy who moves the balance of the LSU campus to where it is today. He is responsible for the beginnings of a state highway system in Louisiana. Now, all those are good things. He had some shortcomings as well, as we all do. He distrusted the poor, and he distrusted the uneducated. He really felt that he knew what was best for the poor and the uneducated of Louisiana. He was a racist. He desired to further restrict the vote for blacks and for poor whites. And that sort of goes along with number one, right? He distrusted the poor and the uneducated. Who were the poor and the uneducated? It was blacks and poor whites. He was anti-immigrant. And here he is, the governor of the state of Louisiana, and the source of many Louisianans' new citizens. The source is immigration. A lot of foreign people are coming in to the United States during this time period. They're coming from all kinds of places, especially Sicily, Germany, and in the Hammond area, the Hungarians were coming into the country or coming into Louisiana at that time as well. And Parker was not really crazy about that. He really wanted the people of Louisiana to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Now, during World War II, during World War I, 1914 to 1918, Louisiana cotton farmers prospered because there were millions of Americans in uniform during World War I, and they all needed uniforms. And much of the clothing was made, especially the underwear, was made out of cotton. So Louisiana cotton farmers prospered during World War I. It created a boom in cotton. Everybody was planting as much cotton as they could, not realizing that when the war was over, that the demand for cotton was going to skydive, and they were going to be left with a lot of extra cotton that they could not sell. And that's exactly what happened. After the war ends in 1918, cotton prices drop like a stone. Many farmers who had done well raising cotton now literally lose their farms. And those who don't lose their farms are in suffocating debt. And working people begin to demand more and more from their state government. They begin to demand paved roads, better schools, Louisiana schools. Let's see, what's the word I'm looking for? Louisiana schools sucked. Okay? I mean, public schools were terrible. If you could afford it, you send your student to a private school or a parochial school. And almost every little town had a parochial school. What am I really saying? A Catholic school, right? Sure. They wanted help they wanted monetary assistance for their farms. They wanted big business regulated. They felt that they were being cheated left and right by big business. Now, the political elites of Louisiana, most of whom were Democrats, uh, saw that these changes that were being demanded by the common people, were excessive, and that the common people were demanding too much of government. It wasn't the job of government to provide these things. But the people of Louisiana found a politician who promised to deliver on those promises. And not only did he promise to deliver, he did deliver. And his name was Huey Pierce Long. Now, Huey P. Long was born up in North Louisiana in 1893. And if you recall, what we said just a few moments ago is that the North Louisiana parishes were sort of the seedbed of populism in the state of Louisiana. It was a place where um, blacks and poor whites came together as close as they ever had uh, in a to create a common front against the two major parties. Wynn Parish was very independent minded. The people of that parish were independent minded. Matter of fact, Wynn Parish had voted in 1861, had voted against secession. They didn't want to join the Confederacy. They wanted to stay right where they were as a part of the United States. And once the state of Louisiana did, in fact, secede from the Union, Wynn Parish people gave grudging support to the Confederacy. They sort of held their nose, right, and supported the Confederacy. Long's grandfather um, ran away. He evaded Confederate service. Never did serve. Went out in the woods and hid out. After the Civil War was over, the people in Wynn Parish never became strong Democratic Party supporters. They liked to, you've heard the term, march to the beat of a different drummer. Well, that certainly applied to the people of Wynn Parish, Louisiana. In the 1880s, many Wynn Parish farmers joined the Farmers Alliance, which was a precursor of the Populist Party. Now, I could give 2 or 3 lectures on the Farmers Alliance. I'm not. I'm simply going to tell you that many of the people who began life as members of the Farmers Alliance wound up as populists. And when the Populist Party came into existence, the people of Wynn Parish supported it. They endorsed the Populist Party. Here's an interesting number. The United States never, ever, ever um, supported socialism. Now, we've had socialist candidates for years now, but we've never had a socialist president, not yet. We'll see what happens. But that's neither here nor there. I probably shouldn't have even said that. But the point is that in 1912, a socialist candidate by the name of Eugene Debs ran for president, and he got about 10% of the votes nationwide. Nationwide, Americans voted, 10% of Americans voted for the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs. In Wynn Parish, 36% of the votes went to Eugene Debs, the socialist. So you can see that in Wynn Parish, and that is Huey Long's home parish, Wynn Parish doesn't really care what the rest of us think about it. They do their own thing. As a matter of fact, Long's father, in the year 1900, ran as a Democrat for the state legislature. He ran as a Democrat, but it was a populist platform. Now, Long was solidly middle class. The Long family was not rich, but they were not sharecropping people who didn't know where their next meal was coming from. Pretty solidly middle class. He grew up, though, among people who, many of whom felt cheated and oppressed. His politics grew up from that tradition in Wynn Parish of marching to the beat of your own drummer, of not paying attention to what other people were doing, but following your own path. He was bright, but he never graduated from high school. He had an argument with the principal. He dropped out, never went back. But he was widely read. He was a voracious reader, and he remembered everything that he ever read. He became, one of his first jobs, he became a traveling salesman, selling cooking oil and other home products. He didn't get rich, but he met a lot of people with that photographic memory. That photographic memory became a really valuable tool for him because he never forgot a face and he never forgot a name. And boy, what a great asset for a politician. He learned how to sell himself. He got married, moved to New Orleans, decided he wanted to become a lawyer. But he had never even finished high school. So how could he become a lawyer? Well, he had to be a smooth talker because he went to Tulane Law School and he talked the faculty there into admitting him as a non-traditional student. And they did. What a talk that must have been to convince them to let him in. Because he didn't have a high school, he didn't have a college degree, he didn't even have a high school diploma. But yet he went to law school at Tulane Law School, but the money finally ran out. And he couldn't go back to law school without the tuition. That sounds familiar to some of you, doesn't it? Sure does. Once again, as a proof of how he had this gift of gab, he went to the Louisiana State Supreme Court and he convinced them to administer to him and just to him a special bar exam. And they did it. And he passed it. So now, here is Huey Long with a fresh law degree, and he's passed the bar exam, and he's ready to go practice law. He moved to Shreveport, and where he began to practice law, and he was exempt from service he was deferred from service in World War I because he was married and had a child already. By the way, that child was his oldest son, Russell Long, who would later become a U.S. Senator from the state of Louisiana and serve in that capacity for decades. Okay, that's almost an hour. I'm going to stop. That's a good place to stop. And we'll come back and we'll continue examining the life and the career of Huey Pierce Long. And I'll see you soon.